Hello and welcome to another science fiction related video from Luke Orlando Fiction. My new website is in the link below. Alright. So this video is a little different than the last one. In fact, it's the opposite of the last one. The last video that I made was about science fiction and fantasy, what they are, and why you should read them. This video is for all those people who read too much science fiction and fantasy and want to read something else. I've heard this from a lot of people. They're like, all I ever read is science fiction and fantasy, and I want to read something else, but I don't know what. So there's a lot of different options. Typically when people have this complaint, I hear them wanting to get into more like classic literature, to literature with a capital L, right? You obviously could go and read something, some domestic fiction, something that was written today. You could go read maybe a spy novel, a James Bond or something. But there's science fiction elements even in those, even in the most like reserved of Tom Clancy novels. There's some pretty sci-fi stuff in there. And again, I wouldn't classify a lot of this stuff as literature with a capital L. So I'm not being elitist or anything. I'm just saying this is the complaint that people have, is that they haven't gotten into a lot of classic literature. So if you are a sci-fi fan and you want to get into some classic literature, I have a recommendation for you. I've thought through all the authors that I have read, that I'm familiar with, and that I think could be a nice stepping stone. And I've come down on one author in particular, and I've come up with 3 reasons why I think you should read his work. And I even have chosen a book from his repertoire that I think would be a good starting point. So, with no further ado, the author that I think you should read if you're a sci-fi or fantasy enthusiast and you want to break out of that genre is Emile Zola. I'm going to put a picture of him right here. Emile Zola is a French author who was born in 1840 and died in 1902. Lived a pretty short life, actually, but he definitely made it a full one. Emile Zola is the number one person that I would recommend for you if you want to dive into some classic literature for 3 reasons. First reason is that he's French. That might sound like a weird reason, but I'll explain why. Him being French gives us 2 important things. One, it actually, because of the timeline, it makes him a contemporary of Jules Verne. So if you've read Jules Verne, you can definitely read Zola. Okay, so if you've read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you can read Emile Zola's work, right? It'll be the same thing. It'll be a translated French work. And that's the second point. That's why I think him being French is important, is that his work is going to be translated into English. So if you're an English reader and you want to read something from 1800s, you're gonna have a hard time because the language is so different, right? Whereas French has not changed as much. Not that you're gonna be reading it in French, but what it means is that when you translate it from French to English, people are very good at that. People are very, very good at that. And they make those translations accessible for people today because their modern translation needs to sell. So if you read Zola's work, grab a translation from 2000. You know what I mean? Right? Grab a translation from the 90s. I think there's a Penguin Classics that was done in the 90s. I don't remember if they were the ones that commissioned it, but whatever. Point is, he's French. Okay, number 2. I think you should read Emile Zola because he is like a sexy French Charles Dickens. Okay, what do I mean by sexy Charles Dickens? Well, what I mean by this is that he writes many of the same things that Dickens does. He writes about many of the same things. He writes about the lower classes. He writes about day-to-day life and people struggling against their position in life. Sometimes existential, usually more naturalistic or more related to the Industrial Revolution and how the dehumanization of people was really a crime, right, against humanity. That's a big, big theme in his works and the main subject of the book L'Assommoir, or The Drinking Den, which is the book that I recommend you read. He's a sexy French Charles Dickens, kind of literally. Literally. Dickens had to write primarily for the English, and the English during Dickens' time were extremely puritanical about their depictions of sex and violence in literature, it had to be pretty clean. Not that, people in his era weren't having their own problems, because, there was also an outbreak of syphilis in that time period. So, kind of a double standard there. But that is the way of it, right? They wanted their depictions of sex and violence to be fairly clean, much like a sort of what we would consider like a boomer mentality today. Get that sex and get that violence off my TV, right? Whereas something like Game of Thrones sits there and is like, no, all the sex and violence. But that actually brings me to my next point. He is not overindulgent. Okay, I want to make that very clear. I'm not saying that he has tons of sex and violence and that's a good thing. I'm saying that he depicts it realistically, and that is what is good. I personally found much of Game of Thrones to be extremely excessive. I don't think it represented any kind of reality that I'm familiar with. It was fantasy, I know, but it tried very hard to be grounded for at least a couple of seasons. And it never really felt grounded to me. The people were all far too eager and willing to stare at the camera and rip their shirts off. It was just completely overindulgent, and I did not find it interesting. I found it kind of ridiculous. But that's a tirade for another day. L'Assommoir, or The Drinking Den, and Zola's other works do depict sex and violence in an extremely frank way. And again, I think that's a good thing. His depictions of sex and violence are always tempered by reality. They're tempered by a need to communicate an idea. So for instance, in Germinal, there's a 15-year-old girl named Catherine who has multiple instances of being depicted in sexual situations or in the nude or whatever. Now, of course, you're sitting there thinking, whoa, that sounds wrong, right? It's like, well, yes, that's exactly why he's depicting it. He's like, this is wrong. This 15-year-old girl should not be forced to go 700 meters into the bottom of a mine shaft, rip off her clothes, and then be forced to push a 200-pound tub of coal across a 7-kilometer track, all the while breathing in methane gas and trying not to die. She shouldn't be doing that, right? That's his point, okay? And his depictions of sex and violence and, even just sexual themes, not even like just openly sex, were really instrumental in revealing a lot of these things to the general public. They didn't know what was happening in these places. So Zola was able to reveal a lot of these things to people. So any depictions of sex that he has are tempered by reality and a need to express it. And if it does seem like, oh, this is a bad thing, that's the point. That's why he's showing you. Okay? So, for a lot of science fiction fans, this is going to be a huge draw. The fact that he doesn't shy away from reality, right? If you read something like The Handmaid's Tale, that novel depicts sex and non-consensual sex frequently, but that doesn't mean it's indulgent and going, and it's not a rape fantasy novel, right? It is a dire warning regarding religious, a religious takeover of a culture, right? And I don't think any science fiction fan is going to sit there and say that The Handmaid's Tale is overindulgent, right? I think they're going to say, kind of seems familiar, right? So let's move on to my last point. Now, this is the most important point for me. This is the one that I think really sells him. Okay. Emile Zola writes as if you've never heard of France. Okay. His novels are incredibly accessible to anybody who's never heard of a coal mine or seen the inner workings of an 18th or 19th century laundromat. Okay. He depicts anything and everything in such a clear and vivid way as if you've never seen them before. So at the time, it might have seemed excessive, but today his works have aged incredibly well because I don't know about you, but I don't have a time machine. I've never been to a 19th century laundromat, But Zola describes it for us so we know what it is. He doesn't say they went to the laundromat. He says there were buckets upon buckets upon buckets of human urine, stale and crusted into white ammonia-filled bleach that was shoved into the cotton fibers and stepped on and then washed out, and then they took, bird poop and deconstructed that, and like you could smell it, you could see it, you could taste it, right? All the horrible, zit covered realities of life are on display in a way that Dickens would never do. Right? And that makes his works amazing. That makes his work so sci-fi like, in that it's describing a world that to us doesn't exist. Yes, to him it does, but to us it doesn't exist, so we get to see it for the first time. While reading Germinal, I was so blown away by the description of the coal mine. I was so confused by it that I had to actually look it up. I was like, no way, he has to be exaggerating, right? It's like, no. The coal mine did go that deep, and yes, they did run that long, and yes, they did have to work in spaces that small and cramped, and yes, that many people did die. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, if I had read that novel and not known any better, if somebody had told me it was a science fiction novel or a fantasy novel, I would have believed him. I'm like, there's no way the mines were like that. And sure enough, I look it up and they are. So, it's incredibly edifying and educational. And I think, for those of you who read too much science fiction and fantasy, this would be the stepping stone. Now, I'm talking a lot about Germinal, but that's because I recently read it, so it's fresh in my mind. But this one's actually my favorite. The Drinking Den is the start. It's a starting point for several other novels based on the main character in this novel. I think Gervais is her name. She's sort of like the matriarch of a family of characters who he then writes about later. So if you like this book, you now have several others that follow characters you're already slightly familiar with. So I think it works really well as a starting point for getting into some more traditional literature with a capital L. All right, so I'm gonna wrap this video up. If you read too much sci-fi and fantasy and you want to read something more traditional literature with a capital L, I recommend Emile Zola, because he, one, is French, so his works have been translated and are therefore accessible. Two, he's a sexy French Charles Dickens. What's not to love about that? He depicts his work and sex and reality in a way that other people were too afraid to do. And he writes as if you've never heard of France. So everything that you read is now accessible to you because he describes it. He doesn't assume you know anything, and it feels like he's describing a whole new world for you. And as Ray Bradbury says, you stand upon the precipice and look in on this rather frightening depiction of a world overtaken by industrialization. Whereas he says, to depict the inevitable downfall of a working class family in the polluted atmosphere of our urban areas. If that's not relevant, then I don't know what is. Thank you for watching. Once again, my new channel, I renamed this channel, but my new website is down below. It has the same name as my old website, but now it's official, it's Googleable. So if you would like to get some more content like this, please consider liking and subscribing this video and checking out my website below. Please check out my website. I have 3 science fiction short stories that I publish there every month for you. Okay, and there will be a science fiction book published there sometime soon, depending on when you're watching this video. I don't know, you could be watching this from the future, so hello from the past. In which case, there will be a free book for you. So, thank you for watching again, and I hope to see you next time.